Thank you, Mark, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Lovely to see you all. I echo his sentiments. It's a great joy to be together face to face and to see you all tonight. And I'm going to give an overview of the Isle of May study, which commenced in 1972. And I can't cover all of the research that we've done there, but I'm trying to give a flavour of the work that we've done and to set it in context far beyond the Isle of May, hopefully, to give us some food for thought as we listen to all the talks from all the disparate places over the next few days and how they might fit into a bigger picture, which is the conservation of seabirds, which we all share. So the Isle of May, for those of you that don't know, is off southeast Scotland, and our study is of 6 species: European shag, puffin, kittiwake, guillemot, razorbill, and fulmar. And this is, as Mark said, one of the most comprehensive studies of its kind in the world, and we're indebted to the extraordinary work by Mike Harris and Sarah Wanless. Mike started the study in 1972, and Sarah joined him a few years after, and these two worked together and still do work tirelessly for the project. And they had a great vision for what they wanted to do there, and they were a great team. They had complementary strengths and worked really well together, and are a big reason why there are 300 papers out of this study. And they understood the importance of a study of population ecology and how that needed to be based in its foundation on sound estimation of demographic rates in order to then look at some of the drivers of change in seabird populations, and associated with those demographic rates, fundamentally core studies of diet and foraging behavior. But they didn't work alone, and there are a number of people that spent several years on the Isle of May, and these are those folk that have probably spent several or up to into double figures people that I wanted to particularly recognize, but there are a huge number of others, including a number in the audience who did PhDs or spent 3 or 4 years. You note the proliferation of boiler suits. Can I recommend those to all those undertaking field work as our first take-home message for tonight? Carry gun has been a tower of strength over the last 10 to 12 years, so I wanted to give her a special mention. And Morten Fredrickson, although he's in a boiler suit, possibly his biggest contribution was more in his writing really groundbreaking papers, particularly on the effects of climate change and fisheries. And they were all led dutifully by Mark Newell, who, when I looked online for pictures of him, nearly all of them seemed to be with his hand down a puffin burrow, whether that's because everyone has a similar sense of humour with their camera, or whether that's all he does. Well, I'll leave that to you. Mark has been leading the field campaign for 17 years and has done extraordinary work. And I want to, of course, recognise him in particular. One thing to touch on as well, I think a lot of us felt this as well. I also wanted to recognise not only all of the people that I have and haven't mentioned, but also those that were facing the COVID and avian flu situation over the last 3 years. There's potentially only one thing that's more tough than a really long, hard field season on seabirds, and that's not being allowed to do that field season. And so I want to recognise, Mark and Carrie, of course, are involved, but also in the audience, I think tonight we have Ella Benninghouse and Sam Langlois. And those guys were in the field at times when they couldn't work. And this is by no means a criticism of those that made decisions that didn't allow the work to proceed because of the extreme situations we were in, but it's just a comment on human nature, really, and that we all prefer to work than to lay idle. So fantastic work to them, to holding it all together and collecting what data they could. But also thank you to NatureScot, formerly known as Scottish Natural Heritage, owners of the island and providers of a really high-class accommodation and a set of logistics which wouldn't have been possible, which our study wouldn't have been possible without that. They help us with the transport, the classic problem with islands, the days in which boats can come, top right, and bottom right, the days in which they can't. So thank you to them for allowing us to work there and being such excellent colleagues. So as I touched on before, Mike and Sarah focused on this idea of a classic population ecology study. So we have a lot of emphasis on estimating demographic rates, in particular adult and immature survival and productivity. In some of our species, we can look at dispersal and migration as well. We use colour ringing for that survival and movement data. And then, as I said, a lot of focus on diet, and that's through these different techniques that I'm sure you're all familiar with, to do with digestion of samples, observations, and so on. And we've tried to, as best we could, grasp any emerging technology with respect to animal-borne instrumentation. Sarah Wanless and her colleagues, Mike, of course, were among the first to be deploying data loggers like the VHF tracker in the bottom right here in the early 1980s. And we have, like everyone else, followed what's available up to these extraordinary UVA tags that collect incredible detail on the foraging ecology of these species. So the study started in 1972 because the island was chosen to document how well puffins could perform under apparently optimal conditions. So the reason that is there'd been quite widespread declines of puffins and other species in different parts of the UK and East Atlantic, and the Isle of May was growing from very few pairs over the period of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And this is a quote from their book, just to, by the way, which is a really nice monograph. If you want to see how a good monograph is done, I'd recommend their book. Of course, in fact, spoiler, the situation didn't stay the same. The Isle of May did not retain its optimal conditions status over the next half decade. So these are plots of breeding success and adult survival of the puffin population on the Isle of May. You can see that the breeding success was declining ever so slightly, and then had a particularly strong blip in the second half of the year 2000s. And this is something that we saw a lot in our data, that that period from about 2004 to 2008 was particularly poor on the Isle of May. And the adult survival was extraordinarily high at the start of the study, and you can see actually two things here in the bottom left-hand graph. One is a steady decline, but also punctuated by certain numbers of years of very low survival. And this is one of the recurring themes, I think, in our study and in most people's, that it's a mixture of gradual change punctuated by the effects of extreme events. And that twin low survival year, a pair of years in the late 2000s, coincident with poor productivity, led to a population crash of our puffin population that had been growing at 10% per year up until then, despite a steadily changing demographic rate, still very favorable. And it was only at that point that we started to see things getting bad for them. But this punctuated change is really important. You can see since then the population has been comparatively stable. And quite a lot of the variation that we see in our populations on the Isle of May can be explained by perhaps 5-10% of the years. And that's an important message for us all when we're trying to think about extreme events and how we understand those in the context of gradual change. Looking at some of the behavioral values that we can get, this is provisioning food loads, which is the food the puffins bring back to their young. And that shouldn't say food loads, sorry. The lower one is fledgling weights of those young. Again, you can see, particularly the lower one, a steady decline, and then this poor period in the late 2000s when we saw that conditions were particularly poor. So something went wrong in our system then, and it's improved somewhat since. So we also try to understand population regulations. So we try to see where the constraints are that prevent populations either exploding to exponential numbers or going extinct. This is a nice example from Sophie Bennett, who is at the conference this week, so please talk to her for more information. She's giving a talk as well on the follow-up to this work. So she was interested to know whether average site quality, that's nest site quality, was negatively related to colony size or population size. And if it was, and that would then lead to average breeding success being higher at low population size, that would provide some sort of resilience. And that's known as the buffer effect, and it allows low population sizes potentially to recover. And she found this over populations that were showing significant fluctuations. This is common guillemots in our study. So we're also interested in some of those regulatory processes, but we also see a lot of species differences. The patterns that I showed for puffins were broadly true for our 3 auk species and for kittiwake, but Shag has shown rather a different trajectory. So Rich Howells, who's here this week, studied this for his PhD, and he was able to use a 50-year data set to show that productivity had actually increased as opposed to decreased, which was much more apparent in the other species. So it's an entirely different ecology to the others. It's an inshore feeder. The others are offshore. He also documented a marked change in diet, shown here in the lower graph, with the yellow bars are sand eels, the classic prey of these species, and whilst remaining very important, a decline in its importance in the latter half of the study, and this has continued in the years after he completed his work. And that lesser importance of sand eels has been replicated in nearly all of our study species, and yet it's only in the shag that it's actually had a positive effect. For most of them, it's had a negative effect. So important species differences that we try to incorporate in our understanding. So that's a little flavor of some of the demography and diet data that we've collected. Then I want to move on to drivers of change, and one of the key ones that we've been interested in is climate change operating as a bottom-up process through the food web, whereby climate affects the oceanography, and that has knock-on effects through the food web up to top predators such as seabirds. And what that predicts is a positive correlation between each trophic level, whereas a top-down based ecosystem would predict a negative relationship. And that's in one of Morton's most important papers when he was working on the project, is what he found, and this was a positive relationship between diatoms and copepods, between copepods and sand eels, and finally between sand eels and an index of seabird productivity. So this was quite strong evidence of bottom-up control in our system. And it is strongly related to a steady warming that has taken place over the last 50 years in the system, which seems to have had broadly negative effects on our system operating through changes in sand eel populations. Morton took this work further to look at environmental suitability, and what he showed was that over the predicting forward over the course of the next 100 years, a reduction in environmental suitability, not just on the Isle of May, which is represented by the East Scotland plot in the bottom left, but in collaboration with colleagues, some of whom are in the audience, the same at other colonies further north from us. But overall, a higher suitability the further north you go. And this is some of this idea of thermal thresholds that mean above which in terms of temperature, but below which in terms of latitude, you get lower condition and abundance of key prey. And this predicted a reduction in productivity of several of our species by the end of this century. So this is this idea of a reduced environmental suitability mapped onto the retrospective analysis that I showed you before this. But as I said before, we're interested in these extreme events, these not necessarily particularly common, but potentially very profound moments in the history of our study. And these can be very visible events, and lots of birds being washed up dead. We saw another of those with auk wrecks in the autumn, and we saw, of course, a very different sort of thing happening with avian flu, which I'll touch on later. But the visibility can be confusing because it can give an impression of a very large event, but it may actually merely be because a certain proportion are coastal and are washing up on our beaches. But for one of our species, the European shag, it is an important process on the east coast of the UK, where there is a very rather uniform coastline and very little shelter, very few islands, and this inshore feeder is very strongly susceptible to sustained poor weather in winter. And again, another paper of mine, Morton, showed us that this combination of precipitation and onshore wind was extremely bad news for these populations. And of course, as many of you are aware, many of the climate models are predicting an increase in the frequency and severity of these events. So this could be very serious for this species. But we were interested to understand whether these extreme events affected different proportions of the population disproportionately, or whether it was affecting them all simultaneously. And in close collaboration with Jane Reed, formerly of Aberdeen University, now at NTNU, we commenced this colouring study, which we've been undertaking on the Isle of May for a couple of decades. We expanded it out to several colonies and then instigated a large-scale, year-round re-sightings program. And the advantage, this is in European shags, and the advantage they have is they come to roost during the day and every night, every day of the year. So unlike most seabirds that disappear far from land and can only really be followed with data loggers and not nearly at the sorts of sample sizes that allow you to do very strong and robust survival analyses, here we could mark tens of thousands of individuals, and as we have done so over the last 12 years or so, and then follow them throughout the year and pick them up again in the breeding season because they're all colour-ringed and record their breeding success. And so we have this year-round picture at the individual level. And what's interesting about European shags is a proportion of the population stay resident at their breeding colony and a proportion migrate. Not the sorts of distances that people who work on Arctic terns would get excited about, but in the year of a life of a shag, 300 kilometres is a lot. And so we have this strung-out population in winter, and we were interested to know whether extreme events, which of course in the case of shags is extreme storms, which show local structure, local heterogeneity, whether we would see differences to do with that local environment, or whether actually migrants and residents had different susceptibility. And so this study it takes a good proportion of our time. We used to have 4-month field seasons, and the grey hairs on Mark's head is because we now have 12 months field seasons, partly because of this year-round study. And so, but it has been an incredible effort by colleagues at Aberdeen University, ourselves, a huge number of fantastic volunteers. And what this graph shows is the survival of these two groups I mentioned, the full-time residents and the migrants. And we had two years where we had low survival associated with poor weather, surrounded by the orange boxes, shown, actually they look rather red on your screen, and 7 years shown here, surrounded by the yellow boxes of more typical years where survival rate was high. And in the years when survival was low, in 2012-13 and 17-18, it was residents that had significantly lower survival. And this was, important evidence in terms of selection on migration, a selective advantage of migrants over residents in two extreme events that we'd seen in our system. Reproduction was actually the other way around, so residents were more successful than migrants, and that's actually a showing that's been found in a number of different studies. There's something about residents, whether it's something intrinsically within themselves or the environment that they experience year-round, they tend to have higher breeding success, particularly in typical years, not so apparent in those extreme years. And yet when we did the population modelling, and I should particularly acknowledge Paul Acker, who led these papers, and Sarah Berth, who worked very closely with him on those. The population model told us that the benefit the residents had from reproduction was not sufficient to counterbalance the negative effect on survival during these extreme events. So that's climate change and extreme events. Fisheries was the other big thing that we were considering, and the reason is that we had a sandeel fishery, the principal prey of these birds, operating throughout the 1990s. And Morten Fredrickson produced this, what is now quite a well-known graph and is used in a number of contexts, was the effect of that fishery on the productivity of one of our species, the black-legged kittiwake, which is one that seems to be particularly sensitive to changes in abundance of their prey. What this graph shows is actually a relationship with SST, sea surface temperature, and productivity. And what Morton showed is that there's both an effect of SST, a negative effect, so that in warm winters, warm summers, breeding success is reduced, but also when there's a fishery operating, it's even lower, so there's an additive effect to the fishery. Now, this study really stood the test of time for at least a decade or so, and then it became apparent that it was not evident in all parts of the North Sea, and people wanted to look at some of the processes underpinning what is essentially quite a difficult set of underpinning processes. There's a long way between sea surface temperatures and the breeding success of a predator, because they don't eat temperature. But also, what is this effect of a fishery? That's actually more or less remains an unanswered question. Why would a sand eel fishery, unless it's causing massive depletion, cause there to be a negative effect on kittiwake and not other species? So the other species were not affected. So we've just looked at this again. So this sand eel fishery was closed in the year 2000 and has remained closed ever since. And Morton looked at it with just a few years post-closure data, and we now have nearly 20 years. I would ask you not to tweet these particular slides that follow, because they are in review in a journal. What this graph shows is our 4 species in the before, during, and after the fishery. So that's the pre-1990, the 1990s, and from 2000 onwards. And for our 3 Yorks, guillemots, puffins, and razorbills, a bit in line with what I've been saying up until now, and particularly because of this problem that they had in the in sort of 2004 to 2008, showed a steady decline in the 3 periods. And so the period when the fishery was operating in the middle period was not the period when they had the lowest breeding success, suggesting some environmental signal was overriding any fishery effect, or whether the fishery itself is actually of no consequence to them whatsoever, and they're entirely driven by environmental conditions. The kittiwake, by contrast, showed a marked decline during the fishery years, matching what the graph I showed before, and only a moderate recovery after the fishery, so not returning to the levels they were in the 1990s. So there probably is some benefit to kittiwakes of the fishery closure, but not sufficient to say that the closure has been entirely successful, and that is the message there is probably closure. Fishery closures are context dependent, and they may be overridden or not, they may be additive or not to environmental conditions, depending how dominant those environmental conditions are on the key seabird traits that you're interested in. This is important at the moment, and I'll come back to this later because of the interest in fishery closures in the context of compensatory measures for offshore wind farms. So it was a key question as to whether the current closure that we have in our system in the North Sea had been effective. And this importance of environmental conditions in particular started with relationships that Morton showed in temperature, and the new data that we were able to add here in this new analysis is the importance of the sand eel signal on the seabirds. The closed area is shown in the grey in that map, which you can barely see, I'm very sorry. And the red area, the red box is called sand eel area 4, where a lot of the sand eel data come from. They're often presented at these very large scales. There's only 6 or 7 areas in the North Sea. And there are also some even cruder data on sprat, one of the other key prey that many of the seabirds have switched to. I told you when I showed Rich Howell's work that there's been a move away from sand eels. For these species, it's primarily been sprat. However, what we found is that the seabirds are really responsive to the availability of these 2 prey types. So for these 4 species, offshore feeding species, the 3 Yorks and kittiwakes, the ratio of sand eels and sprats was very much apparent in their diet. And that diet, the relative importance of sand eels, was important for their breeding success. So it seems to be that in years where there's a high abundance of sand eels, they dominates their diet and they're more successful. This is particularly true here in kittiwakes. It wasn't very clear in puffins at all, but was apparent in the other 2 species. So there's this story emerging of the importance of sand eel biology on the abundance of on the productivity of these seabirds, and then a complicated interrelationship between the actions of the fishery in one of our species, the kittiwake, but not apparent in the other species. We do look at other things as well. We had a workshop this morning on avian flu. Emma Cunningham spoke very nicely at that, and she has been working with us on questions of parasites, in particular in European shags, and we have demonstrated the importance of endoparasites in how it reduces productivity overall, and that's in the Hicks paper from 2019, and in explaining the classic seasonal decline that you see in most seabird populations, whereby breeding success declines as the season progresses at the individual level. And so they're important drivers of productivity, and we've been weaving in, prior to the event that you're all very aware of in the last few months, we've woven in avian flu into our questions before this occurred, which is actually a really nice opportunity because we potentially can compare before, during, and after in a species that currently appears not to have shown any negative impacts in the UK at present. Emma's leading a NERC grant that we were awarded, and that allows us to test this question that whether parasite load is linked to migration, and that wraps in the work I told you before about our big colouring sightings. And also this really key question also for avian flu about whether asymptomatic birds have simply not been exposed, or whether there is variation in susceptibility between those that survive and those that are asymptomatic. And then we've also got an interest in contaminants. Again, it's European shags that seem to be most susceptible with their inshore feeding. We've previously shown high levels of mercury, PCBs, DTTs, and the forever chemicals PFAS. PFAS has been in the news in the last few days, very important. And we've got a NERC grant to look at a gradient of input into the system. This is the Firth of Forth. You see the Isle of May, and another colony, Inchkeith, which is much further up the Forth. And the Forth has a long industrial history and really a sort of west-east gradient of input. As you can imagine, there's far more input at the west, and we're predicting that the exposure to Inchkeith birds will be much higher than the Isle of May. But we're also not just interested in the classic legacy chemicals of metals and organic pollutants, but also pharmaceuticals, microplastics, and other emerging topics. So parasites and contaminants are rising up the agenda for us, but really we're grappling with a number of drivers, probably the only one we haven't seriously had to consider, which I know a lot of you think about, invasive mammalian predators, but we haven't particularly had that in our system. But what we do have in our system is offshore renewable developments. We have 3 consented and 2 more planned. I've only put that no tweet because one of the polygons is wrong, and I don't want and the offshore renewable developer will not be pleased to see the wrong one put in the public domain. So they fund us and our colleagues at RSPB and BIOS to undertake GPS tracking, to look at the overlap with their footprints, and then as they're being constructed and come into operation, we can look at changes that occur as a result of the wind farms coming into their system. And those paler, larger areas offshore is the Scott Wind Round, which is the next round of offshore wind farms. So a lot of landscape changes in our system, but not just landscape, a lot of changes to the below surface environment and potential impacts on birds. I'm sure many of you are fully aware of the potential impact of these on seabirds. So we have a nice opportunity to look at that in some detail. And the approach we take, which we think is important, is we're taking an individual-based approach. And that's because one of the most important impacts is sublethal, the effect of displacement or habitat loss, as opposed to being outright killed, which is, for example, what collision is. Sublethal effects are notoriously difficult to measure. I've already touched on some. A lot of parasites are sublethal, a lot of contaminants are sublethal. The reason you look at individual effects because it is an individual process, and then you look at you monitor the behavior, the energetics and demography at the individual level, and then multiply that up to your population. You get into very difficult problems if you start with a population average from the outside. It's very difficult to pick up sublethal effects. And remember, these are effects over and above everything else that's going on in the system that I've already touched on. So this is, again, a nice opportunity for us to potentially quantify renewables effects using this individual-based approach. And we're encouraging others to potentially use a similar approach. And that then has knock-on effects on body mass and survival, as shown in these plots. We don't just work alone, we do lots of collaboration, and this is some of our most treasured work. We love working with many of those people in this room. It's been a great pleasure over the years. Just some examples here. So Leila Buckingham did a really nice PhD that she's just finished, where she's looked at colony admixing at a very local scale, just in UK colonies. And that's because a lot of the studies have been done at much broader scales, and she was able to pick up big differences in her MEPS paper between razorbills in terms of the level of mixing compared to guillemots. So with razorbills, multi-colonies focusing on one particular part of the North Sea, whereas a much more disparate distribution of multi-colonies in guillemots. Important implications for severity and likelihood of impacts. And Tuna Ryerson, who's here tonight, has done a really nice piece of work in MEPS on the vulnerability to storms in different populations, including the Isle of May, which seems to have rather missed the worst of it. She was rather cleverer of our puffins, unlike some of these other populations which are right in the swing of it. So these, of course, have great strength in looking at these key drivers over the sorts of metapopulation scales that matter so much. And then high seas designation, a really nice example from the BirdLife team for this North Atlantic current and Evelyn Seamount MPA. And then also, so not just, and I should mention, sorry, a lot of this comes from the SeaTrack project led by the Norwegians, Halvard Strom, and many of you know about that. Also, population ecology, so I think we're going to see these more and more now that we have the ways in which they can be analysed in a robust way. Kat Kierhan, who's at the conference, did a really nice study on global patterns of phenological change, and this graph at the top right shows the central line is that there's no average change in phenology in seabirds, and because there's very strong evidence to suggest that most of their prey will be showing changes as a result of warming effects, this could spell problems in terms of trophic mismatch. And then Bill Seideman's led study of temperature and other drivers on productivity, and particular problems in the northern hemisphere, particularly amongst piscivorous birds, including several of our Isle of May populations. So we were very keen to contribute to these sorts of studies. I hope everyone is here too, that we have a number of conversations about how we can combine data. So that's just a sort of quick tour of some of the problems and ways in which we looked at some of the key issues that have faced our seabirds on the Isle of May. I wanted to touch on a few challenges that are still with us. I should add that on another day I might have come up with 5 different challenges. This is not an exhaustive list. You might all disagree. You might have others. Absolutely, completely fair. But one of the perennial issues that we have is the quality of information on prey. I touched on this before in our paper in review. We're often having to deal with fish data that are collected at very large scale. We happen to be fortunate on the Isle of May, shown in the bottom right, that sort of L-shaped box is one of the best studied sand eel regions in the North Sea. And a lot of this is to do with the actions of fishermen and therefore the stock assessments that are done in order to inform that. But there are other parts of the UK with important seabird populations where the prey data aren't so good. And this is just a huge issue that we all have to face. There's a couple of important projects that are kicking off. The OEC Prepared project, and we've just been awarded a NERC EcoWind grant. Both of these will go some way to look at some of the fine-scale interactions between seabirds and their prey and what impacts offshore wind farms have on that. But I think we'll remain challenged at having strong data on prey distributions that allow us to do the sort of national or international studies we wish to do. In terms of research priorities, well, multiple drivers. I've touched on at least 4 drivers and mostly looked at them in isolation. We need to think a great deal about how this is going to work. I think a lot of our sublethal effects, where we can't necessarily demonstrate that they are having an actual direct effect on demography, might actually make an individual more vulnerable to other drivers. So they may play a role in that respect that we need to very much keep an eye on. And we think about this a lot in the context of, for example, parasites, contaminants. Are they making, when they're elevated, them more susceptible to lack of resources, for example? Our Shag work on migration has made us think a lot about evolutionary dynamics of dispersal and migration. This is important in terms of conservation of seabirds, the extent to which they can show evolutionary rescue to the climate change that they're facing. In a lot of contexts, we're not incorporating uncertainty sufficiently robustly. In fact, we're getting underestimated. We're getting apparently accurate estimates of effects, partly because we're not incorporating key uncertainty, as opposed to us truly estimating it and therefore having low uncertainty in reality. So that's an artifact of it not being incorporated. So that's another key question. Accurate future prediction is something that we need to face increasingly in the years ahead. So we've had a couple of nice studies recently. Searle and MEPS and MARPAM have done a huge amount of work in this area, some really nice reports that they've published. That's BTO and RSPB. But both of those and all these studies are really hampered by the fact that there's rather a limited suite of variables that are available as future projections. And unsurprisingly, most of these studies aren't explaining a huge proportion of the variation that they see, because actually what you want to see is not available as a projection. It goes back to the first point about data priorities. We have all these questions, and we have new ones emerging. We've got the offshore renewables question. We've got the avian flu question. We have capacity issues, and I wanted to touch on a couple of these. We've got a field ecologist, seabird ecologist capacity issues, and we've got quantitative ecologist capacity issues. There were some interesting discussions. Tom Hart raised the question of he believes that you can learn to use drones, and he can teach people to use drones. And I think there'll be examples like that where you can train a whole new army of individuals to undertake a new technique that helps us with, for example, in that context, it was the avian flu question. And there'll be other things that are much more difficult. And we need to figure out how we're going to solve that. And there are not enough quantitative ecologists that are able to do the sorts of meta-analyses and analyses that we need to tackle some of these multiple drivers. Funding. Normally you stand up here and say funding's a huge problem. I would actually say yes and no. I mean, funding's always a problem, called it is, but actually there's more money in seabird ecology now in the UK and in Europe than there's, well, for certain. I mean, I've only been doing it for 25 years, but Mike and Sarah tell me it's very much the case. The offshore renewables is the big game changer. We can think really ambitiously about how we can set the foundation to allow us to tackle these multiple drivers. The money is available for some fabulous work in the way that it wasn't in the past. Hence, yes and no. And we can think big and then lobby and get that work funded. And so it leads me on to this question of how we actually go about doing this, and that's what I'll finish on with my talk. And it's this question of hierarchy of monitoring and research intensity. So I started with the Isle of May. I've got a bit broader in what I've been talking about as I've touched on things not just about the Isle of May. But we have, and this is true not just in the UK, but in every country, you have this hierarchy of intensity of monitoring and research. You have high-intensity sites where there will be potentially survival estimates, productivity, diet and phenology, and foraging behavior. You have moderate intensity sites where there are regular counts, possibly some productivity on one or two species, probably not survival, and some diet information. And then you have the low intensity sites. And in the UK, there are a large number of seabird colonies that all that's done is that they're counted every 20 years and there's not much else known about them. So we need to see how to get these to work together in order to allow us to address some of these key questions. So in terms of the low-intensity sites, we're currently completing the 2015 to 2021 seabird count. we need to be very clear what its greatest value is. Is it a national scale figure of change at 20-year scales, or does it have another purpose? Does it have multiple purposes? Can it test the representativeness of the more intensive studies? It's what makes us see whether our subset of colonies are really telling us what's happening at the national scale. In terms of moderate intensity in the UK, and this is a UK-centric view, I suspect it's true of a lot of places, but the Seabird monitoring programme is our sort of resource for these moderate intensity sites in the UK. It's recently been taken over by the BTO, who I'm sure have thought huge amounts about where they're going to take this. These are key questions, because the SNP has always had a challenge, which is it's been tasked with asking multiple questions. So is it going to be strong at telling us about status and trends in individual colonies, and there's lots of context in which that's needed, or can it give us regional and national status and trends? In terms of the first of those objectives, status of individual colonies, we need to establish the power to detect change. The concern is that when we look at some key demographic processes, they tend to be more apparent in longer time series. And that's a power thing, not a biological thing. We need more data on demographic rates. There's a big report by Angus Cook and colleagues, Liz Humphreys heavily involved, calling for a lot more studies on not just counting, but adult and immature survival and productivity in species that are poorly understood. We do need a lot more data on diet. Even in the UK, east versus west, there's a huge variation in the diet within a species across a range, even as small as that. And another key question is phenology. So in terms of that state of individual colonies, we might think we're okay, we're actually got a lot to think about, but we might even have even more to think about if the purpose of the SNP is to provide regional and national trends, which of course we want it to. We want to bring together those moderately intensive colonies to give us a national picture, because we can only do a census every 20 years. And the fundamental problem, of course, is that the site selection for the SNP was not made at random. It was made for all sorts of historical reasons, and it may be that BTO are already well down this road, but as far as I know, the true representativeness of that subset hasn't been robustly tested. But the national census can help establish whether they are indeed representative, and that could be a very important step. But with both of these objectives, whether it's individual colonies or national trends, there's a lot of challenges. We've got site and scope expansion is called for. How do we do that? And how do we do it in a way that allows us to understand ecological coherence, this key question, the sort of metapopulation scale, in order to understand not a series of just so stories at individual non-random colonies. But there's also the human dimension. The BTO work, a lot of their work, of course, is very focused on encouraging volunteers and providing the support to those volunteers. But it's not just volunteers, also professional scientists don't necessarily want to change what they do or start working in a new place because they've just been told that their current place where they've been for the last 20 years isn't where we need the data. So these are tough questions, but we need to face them. And then the high-intensity sites like the Isle of May, there's not very many of them. You know, they've been a fantastic resource for process-based understanding, attribution and prediction, but there's questions of representativeness. Do they tell us about the region that they're in? Are they able to tell us about generic processes that are true for a species wherever it is? And the answer is yes, in some cases and not others, and the detail of that is important. They're also useful for study design. This is a couple of examples where subsets of data we use to help us understand the potential error you get when you don't collect data over the long time windows that we do on the Isle of May, but through short visits. That's the bottom graph. And the right-hand graph is number of resighting visits for kittiwake survival estimates you need in order to get a robust estimate. So after 7, 8, 9 visits, you start to bottom out with the birds that are present. These are useful ways in which these intensive studies can contribute to the national picture. So the question is, do we need to expand our high-intensity sites? Tico Annika Nielsen and his colleagues have done this extraordinary work with the CPOP program of developing 15 intensively monitored sites in Norway. That's a far greater than we do in the UK and nearly other country, possibly every country in the world. It's an extraordinary thing. It was started, Tico, what year? 2005. Okay, so it's becoming a long-term study. We're facing threats. We've got policies that are looking to 2050. So, do we need to think about increasing these? I'm not saying we do. I just think it'd be interesting for us to think about, to chat about, and to, as we listen to everyone's talks, how we answer the key questions. And two key questions that I want us to think about, and then I'll finish. You'll be delighted to hear, because I know I'm eating into your pub time. I touched on it before, the compensatory measures. So with offshore wind farms where there's an overriding public interest, despite predicted negative impacts, they have to compensate for the negative effects that they are causing through compensation. And not only that, there's a strong push now for them to go beyond no net loss to net gain. So we need to develop strategic compensation approaches that maximize success through this entire huge area, given the expansion of offshore wind farms in the North Sea and other waters. What this graph shows is perhaps what you might call a typical, whether it's seabirds or their resources, decline in a temperate, perhaps the North Sea, over the last 30, 40 years. And the yellow bar shows that that's what a predictive model will tell you that that's generally going to continue, so that's a steady decline. You add offshore wind farm effects, and that is generally considered to be negative in most cases. That will further point the arrow downwards, so that's the red line. So we then need to compensate both for the renewables effect itself and to have sufficient headroom to account for climate change to get us back to where we were. But not only that, that's the legislation. We also need to think about net gain, which isn't the renewables legislation, but which is an aspiration of government and increasingly industry to get us into the green zone. So these are challenging to achieve, require what you might call strategic compensation, which is compensation not done by an individual developer, but in tandem and working with government, potentially with sectors, particularly the fishing sector. But there's some really key ecological questions as well, which is, where do we do compensation? Which colonies that are potentially those that are currently contributing most to the ecological coherence of the network? Are those the ones where we should focus our efforts? A lot of those conversations aren't being had in the level of detail with associated analysis that is necessary. And another classic question that's being asked increasingly, and it's partly driven by the legislation to compensate locally where you can, is if your compensation involves attracting birds into a region where harm is expected, you're putting new birds into harm's way. Now, why would you do that? So these are really key questions, and this whole hierarchy of seabird studies is needed to help us with that. And then the other classic, of course, question that we're all thinking about at the moment is avian flu. You've all seen these pictures of how dramatic it's been. This is the Bass Rock. There are a number of key examples in great skua, gannets, terns, common guillemots. And we need to think about species and spatial variation. We've had mixed approaches to data collection that we need to think about the consequences of those and establish it. And we're left at the end of the 2022 breeding season with a limited capacity to understand effects. Now, we will have just completed a full census. So on the one, that's actually really excellent because it gives us a good baseline, but we have to also accept that it might immediately be out of date. But dwell on that it's excellent that we have it. Don't dwell on it being out of date. But it does mean we might need to do something about it. And what are we going to do? We're not going to do another census. Are we going to look at those moderate intensity sites, make sure they're representative? But it's not just about them being representative. This has spatial structure, this disease, that we need to understand. So future monitoring and research, Emma did a much better job than I can for those of you that heard this afternoon, but we need a clear policy that's relevant to HPAI, but also other effects. So decisions on what research and monitoring will be allowed in future based on, I've mentioned onward transmission risk, and all of those sorts of concerns about the work that we do is not in order for us to understand avian risk. And it's not only for that reason. We also need to understand the consequences of potentially stopping work in terms of understanding other effects, and how, whilst it might be precautionary to stop working in order to prevent further problems for avian flu, it may be anti-precautionary for other drivers. And that's a really important message that we need to think about over the next few months as we consider these questions. I know you Southern Ocean folk are having to think much quicker than that. But also, we need to think about what population monitoring we need to do, what population sampling and disease research we need to work with key colleagues. There were some excellent talks from disease people in the workshop. We need to be touching base with all of those. But it's working together with our network of sites from the Isle of May to the site that's counted once every 20 years and never visited again, and how they work best. So I'll just conclude that over the last 50 years, the Isle of May study of seabird populations has produced a number of key insights. We focused on critical questions on the key drivers of change, long-standing threats such as climate change and fisheries effects, and emerging threats such as offshore renewables and avian influenza. One of the key things that we found is marked species difference, and given that conservation of seabirds and other such groups is very species focused, that's very important that we all understand that and why that's occurring. And we have key questions now to support seabird conservation and net gain policies, and how best to use the data we have, and perhaps harder, how best to design future data collection and analysis, especially if we're planning to change long-standing the work that we currently do. National and international collaboration goes without saying. And so I'll just, I felt it was appropriate, rather than me finish with my words, that I would just touch on a sort of final message from Mike and Sarah's excellent monograph on the puffin. It's literally the last two sentences. And what they say is, and the context is that Mike wrote the first puffin book in the mid-1980s. And in 2011, they worked together on a sequel. And what they say is, in the mid-1980s, all the evidence indicated that the general state of puffindom was better than it had been at any time in the 20th century. However, 25 years later, prospects for puffins at many colonies in the East Atlantic seem very different, and seeing a thriving puffin colony in 50 to 100 years' time may involve travelling much further north than the Isle of May. Okay, thanks very much.
Well, my name is Raul. Well, first and foremost, congratulations for these 50 years of wonderful data. Like, I guess it's an awful lot of work to put everything together, but also the results are quite impressive. Just a quick question. From at the beginning, you were mentioning that you work with productivity, with adult survival. The first question I have is do you have information in recruitment, like chicks coming back to the colony every year? That would be the first question. And then the second question for me would be, you have mentioned that low adult survival plus low productivity has led to population decline. Do you have any models that give specific contributions of these parameters to the population demographics? Like, what's more important, or what contributes more to population demographics, like adult survival or chick production?
The dreaded two-part question. That's why I've written down, because you always forget the second one, don't you? The question of recruitment, yes. So the puffin crash that took place in sort of the late 2000s. Population modelling has been undertaken mostly by José Lahoz Montfort, which shows that it can't be explained entirely by the adult survival results. Puffin immature survival was estimated right at the start of the study when, if you remember, the conditions were extremely good, and juvenile survival was also exceptionally high, which was a surprise because even in good conditions, juvenile survival is generally much lower. And by using anything like those sorts of estimates, José was not able to, Spanish, not Portuguese, was unable to replicate the population count. So he came to the conclusion, in the absence of empirical estimates of immature recruitment rates, that there must also have been a significant problem with recruitment as well as adult survival at that time. And it seems to be that all of the key demographic rates of productivity, of survival, and adult survival and immature survival were all affected at that time. And it sort of touches, I'll come to your second question in a second, but I think there's quite a lot of interest. There's an important new paper by Fay in Ecology Letters looking at demographic correlations. It seems to be that things were positively correlated at that time, and it may be to do with environmental conditions that span more than one season, and then on top of that carryover effects that proliferate through summer and winter in these populations. And that whole period was extremely challenging for them in all times of the year, potentially. And not necessarily because of prevailing conditions at all times in all places, but a mixture of that and possibly carryover effects in tandem. In terms of your question of whether survival and productivity are the main contributors, we've done this in various analyses, Shag's, Puffin's, and others, and it is generally the case that the adult survival is the key contributory factor. We don't really have any good examples where productivity dominates, but it can be important.